China's water-based megaprojects receive plenty of press attention, and with good reason, because when we have examples such as a rapidly expanding and modernizing aircraft carrier force and a brand new supposedly world-leading class of nuclear submarines in the works that we can point to, there's certainly no shortage of material for us to cover. But examples such as those are meant to be widely covered. China wants potential enemies to know that it can plonk a carrier strike group off their ports, and it wants them to know that they can turn their capital city into a sheet of glass at a moment's notice should saber rattling get a bit out of hand. The really interesting ones, though, are the ones that might not even exist. And if they do, China really doesn't want you to know about it. And it's one such example that we're going to be dissecting for you today. The possibility that China just might have a secret military spy fleet dressed up in civilian clothes. The accusations of China having a secret spy fleet all hinge around a vessel called the Zhuhai Cloud that was launched in May 2022. She's a modest little thing, being barely 88 meters long, 14 meters wide, and displacing only 2,000 or so tons, a size that, to give you a rough equivalent in your mind, makes her roughly the size of a normal super yacht, as much as one of those can ever be normal anyway. Certainly, she isn't huge when you bear in mind that she has actual duties and responsibilities and doesn't just ferry billionaires about. As for what those duties and responsibilities are, Chinese sources insist that she is just a civilian oceanography research vessel designed to map, survey, and otherwise document the waves and everything that goes on underneath them. They are also particularly keen to emphasize the high-tech and cutting-edge nature of the ship, explaining her as a mothership of sorts for a vast array of unmanned and autonomous surveying equipment. But don't just take our word for it. In the spirit of transparency, here it is from the horse's mouth, specifically from a China Central Television report published in May 2022 that we've translated for you. The Zhuhai Cloud has a spacious deck and is capable of carrying dozens of unmanned systems for air, sea, and submersible operations, as well as various observation instruments. It can deploy these systems in large quantities in the target sea area and perform task-orientated adaptive networking, achieving three-dimensional dynamic observation of specific targets. It's quite a mouthful, isn't it? As for having purely civilian applications, we didn't find a single source that came out right and said this is not a military ship, and instead the claim is made in omission, i.e. they list what she is for, and military applications or any wider formal association with the Chinese Navy is never listed. Here's a later extract of the same article that discusses her own as the Southern Marine Laboratory that demonstrates this. To quote, "The Southern Marine Laboratory is managed under the leadership of Sun Yat-sen University. Developing an intelligent, unmanned mothership is a crucial initiative for the Southern Marine Laboratory, which aims to be on the forefront of both scientific and technological frontiers. In the future, the development of the Zhuhai Cloud will transform traditional marine observation methods, acquiring real-time three-dimensional marine observational data and enhancing the efficiency and level of marine observation. It will also contribute to the training of high-end marine science and technology talents and further enhance innovative capabilities in marine science and technology." Maybe you see what we mean. They don't come outright and say this isn't a military ship, but the implication's pretty obvious. So then, what's the problem? If China is insistent that the Zhuhai Cloud is just a high-tech oceanography vessel, what evidence do the naysayers cite to suggest the contrary? Well, primarily, they point to where she's been since she was launched, a lot of which just happens to be on the edges of contested waters and at military-adjacent installations. For example, in October 2023, she embarked on a voyage from her home port of Zhuhai on China's southern coast toward Dalian in the north, during which she maintained a more or less dead-on distance of 100 kilometers from the coast for the whole trip. I mean, so far so normal. But then, when the time came to make land, she docked at the Dalian Institute of Measurement and Control Technology, who just so happen to also make all of the Chinese Navy's acoustic tech. I mean, it really gets you thinking, doesn't it? And then, on her way home, she went the long way round, around the east coast of Taiwan, rather than hugging the mainland's coast as she'd done before. And while doing so, she just happened to travel right on the very edge of the island's maritime boundary and slowed right down to a speed far slower than she traveled at any other time since leaving her home port. Exactly as she would if she was on a monitoring mission. I mean, it's pretty curious stuff, isn't it? And that's just the tip of the iceberg, because evidence of possible Chinese Navy involvement with the Zhuhai Cloud goes way beyond just this one rather suspect trip. For starters, both satellite imagery and reporting by Xinhua news agency confirmed that she was being built at Hangpu Shipyard in Guangzhou, a shipyard that constructs a lot of military ships such as the Type 054B and Type 053H3 frigates. Note, however, that this is far from damning in and of itself, because the Hangpu shipyard is a vast enterprise which also builds civilian ships, everything from dredgers to feeder containers and even special engineering vessels. I mean, maybe, just maybe, that last particular specialty is why the Zhuhai Cloud was built there, not necessarily due to anything illicit. Admittedly, pictures such as these from July 2022, which show it tied up beside a Type 056A Corvette, don't exactly make it easy to argue that she is a civilian ship, as they very much imply that it came out of the military arm of the dockyards. But ask yourself this: do you know beyond all doubt that it wasn't just stuck there for some sort of convenience? Because we don't, and it wouldn't be right to claim that we did. What really doesn't look good, however, is that when you dig below the surface a bit, it turns out that Sun Yat-sen University actually has quite strong ties to the Chinese military. In 2015, for example, it came out that an entity within the university helped to develop and maintain the Tanhe-2 supercomputer, which the Chinese military uses extensively in its nuclear weapons program, for which it was sanctioned by the US. But while compelling, is this connection necessarily damning? For example, it wasn't the Southern Marine Laboratory specifically which was caught working with the Tianhe-2, so we don't have a certain connection. Consider further that the Massachusetts Institute of Technology is heavily involved with the US military, even being referred to as a cluster of government research laboratories with a very good educational institution attached to it by Alvin Weinberg, a physicist in 1968. Does that then mean that everything that happens within the halls of MIT is therefore done for the US military? Well, given the fact that when that quote was penned, MIT also had Dirk Strook on the books, who was an open Marxist and Soviet sympathizer, well, no, it absolutely doesn't mean that. We need hard evidence to make such claims unequivocally, and for Sun Yat-sen University and its work with the Zhuhai Cloud, such hard evidence simply doesn't exist. Moving away from that, another potential source of evidence for the Zhuhai Cloud actually being a secret military vessel comes from the website of the State Administration of Science, Technology and Industry for National Defense, who list their articles about the ship under its Military Science and Technology tab. Some Western commentators were quick to point this out as an accidental dropping of the ball and revealing of China's hands, which in fairness it could well be. But consider what's more likely. Is it A, that a lowly editor of a government blog somehow knew about such a high-level state secret to begin with, and then somehow let it slip? Or B, said editor couldn't be bothered to make a new tab, so just chucked the articles about Zhuhai Cloud in that tab so that they could clock off on time? And we have to admit, we're leaning more towards B. Let's now step away from the Zhuhai Cloud and have a look at the wider picture, because she is far from the only oceanography vessel China possesses, which acts, well, pretty weirdly. Take the Jianyang Hong 06, for example. Built all the way back in 1993, she is far more conventional than the Zhuhai Cloud. Her equipment is chucked into the water by hand, operated by hand, and there is nothing particularly noteworthy or interesting about her construction beyond maybe her bulbous bow, which you can see poking out of the water on pictures. Similarly, her activities also appear drab at face value, until you realize that she spends a lot of time mapping the waters between Longpo Naval Base, the home of China's nuclear submarines, and key Indian naval installations such as INS Dwarka and INS Sardar Patel. Then there's the Haiyang Shiyu 760. Built in 2015, she too appears to just be a dull and unassuming old-school oceanography vessel. And then you notice that she spends a lot of time off the coast of Bangladesh conducting exploration of seabed resources, and again, just so happens to traverse between there and the waterways that lead to Chinese submarine bases a fair old bit. And as a final example, we can look at the Xi'an 06. She was built in 2020 and is yet another dull and drab-looking oceanography vessel, blah blah blah, you know the deal by now, and she just so happens to spend a lot of time in the waters off of Sri Lanka, a nation that many say China is currently trying to court into its sphere of influence. So, after all that, can we say conclusively that the Zhuhai Cloud is the latest and greatest member of a long and well-established secret fleet of Chinese vessels that conduct covert surveillance and otherwise get involved in all manner of naughtiness in eastern oceans? Well, to be blunt, no. We can't, and it would be disingenuous of us to pretend that we could. Believe me, I wish we could say that, because this video would draw in the click something crazy. But alas, there simply isn't the evidence for that. Equally, however, Neither can we say beyond all doubt that she isn't a secret spy ship, because there is more than a fair amount of circumstantial evidence that points to the fact that she may well be, but we simply don't have enough information to render a firm judgment. So we'll leave the ball of judgment in your court. You've heard the evidence, and we encourage you to make up your own mind. And while you do that, here's something else to consider. Even if it came out that China does have a fleet of secret spy ships, would it even matter? Often, the idea is presented in a way that presents China as a baddie of sorts. But in reality, every major naval power does it to one extent or another. So would such ships actually be a sign of OTT Chinese aggression, or just a sign that China does what everyone else does to protect its own geopolitical interests? Certainly, it'd be naughty, it'd be worthy of condemnation, make no mistake, but a unique evil committed by China? We'd certainly struggle to make that case. To further expand on this idea, which is vital for our framing of this whole discussion, let's now bring this chapter to a close and go on to discuss other nations' secret spy ships in more depth, because, well, why not? Unfortunately, secret spy ships are simply a reality of modern warfare and geopolitics, and it wouldn't be right, nor good journalism on our part, to provisionally wag our finger at China without making it blatantly apparent that they are far from the only kid on the block to be up to this kind of thing. Such ships go back way further than you might have initially imagined, with the first kind of crude proto-spy ships appearing in the interwar period, a time when tensions were heating up considerably. I mean, it was obvious that another big war was on the horizon, and in those days the major powers wanted every bit of intel that they could get their hands on. For an example of this type of early spy ship, consider the American USS Gold Star. Commissioned in February 1922, she spent the first 11 years of her service just as a normal cargo ship for the US Navy, making regular supply runs between Japan, China, and the Philippines. This was before she was given a secret secondary role in 1933, one that saw her outfitted with a plethora of radio equipment buried deep in her belly. She was to monitor Japanese communications as she sailed from one Asian port to another. She excelled at her new task too, and did it diligently until December 1941, when a little ruckus over in Hawaii suddenly made sneaky ships rather redundant. Come the resolution of said ruckus and the start of the Cold War, tensions once again began to boil the world over, and so the US once again began investing in technical research ships. As far as the public were concerned, these ships conducted atmospheric and long-distance communication research, but in reality, they were spy ships through and through, which used a gyro-stabilized antenna to bounce their live feed of data off the moon and back to the US mainland for immediate use by the military. In addition to them, the US also had environmental research ships, smaller ships that performed more or less the same task but with the cover of being oceanography vessels, and there were also auxiliary general ships which, like the Gold Star before them, used the cover of being cargo ships. Interestingly, one of those environmental research ships, the USS Pueblo, was captured by the North Koreans in 1968, who keep it as a trophy to this day. The North Koreans claim they caught it red-handed in their territorial waters with a hull full of damning intelligence documents, and the Americans claim it was operating in international waters and abiding by all international maritime law. Which version is correct? I mean, nobody knows, because, let's be frank, neither side is going to freely admit to any naughtiness. And in the same way that we said it appears that China may have a secret civilian spy fleet, it appears as though America may still be up to such tricks in the present day. But forgive us if we don't go into too much information on this one. Very little of it is reported upon, and as much as it is rather easy to build an idea of potential ships from open source intelligence networks, we can't help but think it'd be a bit stupid of us to go into that here today, so forgive us for holding our tongues. Also, note the word may here. We're not saying that they do have such ships, just that they might. A vital distinction that we're rather keen to make apparent because we don't want to wind up Uncle Sam. We should also stress, because this chapter has been quite US-centric so far, the Americans are far from the only ones who have operated those types of ships before. Take the Soviets, for example. They repurposed ordinary fishing trawlers, outfitted them with advanced sensors and communication gear, and staffed them with skilled military crews. These unassuming vessels, officially termed auxiliary general intelligence ships by the US Navy and colloquially known as tattletales, were tasked with shadowing US Navy movements, gathering crucial data from naval bases, and monitoring weapons test sites to record various electronic and acoustic signatures. And Russia, the Soviet Union's chief inheritor, is still up to it today. Indeed, as recently as April 2023, intelligence released by the US pointed the finger clearly at the fishing trawler Taurus, originally built back in 2013 as part of an upward of 50-ship-strong secret spy fleet that was monitoring NATO submarine movements in the Baltic Sea and used the Admiral Vladimirsky oceanography ship as a hiding-in-plain-sight mothership of sorts. Chiefly, this claim was rooted in the weird movements of the Taurus while it was supposedly catching fish and flogging them in Danish ports, movements that were wholly out of keeping with civilian fishing vessels and that just happened to bear an uncanny resemblance to the routes used by NATO submarines. What a coincidence. And these are just examples from the big navies. There are even more to point to from history if we look at smaller maritime powers. For example, the Argentine Navy operated the ARA Narwhal, an old fishing trawler that was decked out and refitted as a spy ship. And we only know about it because it was outed during the Falklands War and promptly had a 1,000-pound bomb dropped on it by a Royal Navy Harrier. Invariably, it is difficult to be comprehensive here, because we typically only know about this stuff after some kind of data leak, national collapse, or some counterintelligence work outs it to the public. But we at least do know enough to say that with reasonable certainty that pretty much everyone is at it, and that brings us back to the dilemma that we went into this chapter musing about. How should we consider China's secret spy ships if indeed it does turn out to have such ships? Would they be evidence of China being an evil aggressor on the world stage? Maybe. Would they be evidence that we shouldn't uniquely demonize China since everyone is at it? Well, could well be. Or is it a matter of hegemon, and us having to single out China because it is a threat to the current world order that the West sits atop? Also, maybe. It all hinges on your own worldview, your own experiences, and your own biases. And we shall leave you to make up your own mind on China's potential spy fleet.